China and Russia proclaim a strategic partnership with no limits, but beneath the surface, Beijing appears to be positioning itself for a much larger goal: Siberia. While Putin clings to this fragile alliance in hopes of bolstering his war efforts, China's true objective seems to be weakening Russia and eventually reclaiming the vast resource territories of the Russian Far East. Russia's dwindling population and war-stricken economy make it increasingly vulnerable, and China is well aware of this. Siberia, with its abundant natural resources and strategic importance, represents a prize of immense value. For Xi Jinping, this is about more than economic gain. It's part of China's long-term vision for global dominance, encapsulated in the Great Rejuvenation. But just how far is China willing to go? To understand that, we must delve into what the Great Rejuvenation means and why Siberia is crucial to this grand ambition. Xi, like Putin, is a revanchist leader haunted by historical losses. For Xi, the humiliations China endured during the 19th and early 20th centuries, including the ceding of territories now part of Russia, remain a driving force. This history includes Russia's eastward expansion, which clashed with Qing dynasty territories in Siberia, including modern Vladivostok, once known as Haishanwai. Tensions between the two empires culminated in the Treaty of Nerchinsk, 1689, which granted China control of the upper Amur Valley. However, by the mid-19th century, the Qing dynasty had weakened significantly, allowing the Russian Empire to impose the Treaty of Aigun, 1858, reversing Nerchinsk and seizing lands north of the Amur River. 2 years later, the Convention of Peking handed Russia even more territory, cutting China off from the Sea of Japan. Modern Vladivostok became a symbol of these unequal treaties, which the Chinese Communist Party and Xi in particular often cite as historical injustices. This narrative of unequal treaties has fueled China's territorial ambitions, most notably with Taiwan. Beijing justifies its claim over Taiwan by framing it as part of its historic territory. However, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te recently challenged this reasoning, questioning why China has not applied the same logic to reclaiming territories ceded to Russia under the Treaty of Aigun. The difference lies in China's approach. While it aggressively pressures Taiwan, its strategy toward Russia is more measured, leveraging economic ties and long-term influence to keep its options open. Nevertheless, China's grievances over its lost territories are far from forgotten, and its methods, economic, diplomatic, and strategic, reflect a calculated effort to advance its foreign policy goals without direct confrontation. China and the Soviet Union clashed over these territories in 1969 during a brief but intense border conflict. After losing the war, China refrained from revisiting the issue until 1991, when it resumed negotiations following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Talks continued throughout the 1990s and 2000s as China and Russia worked to improve relations in response to the rise of the United States as a global hyperpower. Both nations shared the goal of establishing a multipolar world order, but resolving their border disputes was essential for effective cooperation. In 2008, an agreement was reached to officially demarcate the border between the two countries, leaving it largely unchanged apart from minor adjustments. While this seemed to settle the matter at the governmental level, it did little to appease many Chinese citizens who continued to advocate the restoration of lost land. These feelings flared up again in 2020, when the Russian embassy in China celebrated the founding of Vladivostok. Outraged Chinese social media users condemned the celebration, pointing to the city's history as former Chinese territory. Beijing took note of these revanchist sentiments. In 2023, China's Ministry of Natural Resources published a map that reignited the debate. It referred to Vladivostok by its historical Chinese name, along with other places in the Russian Far East, while asserting that official maps must accurately reflect the extent of China's territory. This move, while symbolic, was in line with China's broader territorial claims, such as those over the South China Sea and Taiwan, and signaled that Beijing considers these areas to be historically Chinese. The timing of the map's publication was significant. It coincided with Russia's weakened state and growing dependence on China in their strategic partnership. But China's interest in the Russian Far East goes beyond historical grievances. Siberia's rich natural resources are a powerful incentive. Despite its vast landmass, China is relatively resource poor. Decades of environmental mismanagement and pollution have exacerbated the scarcity of critical resources such as water, while poor agricultural practices have reduced arable land. The Russian Far East, on the other hand, offers immense untapped potential. It has 220 million hectares of unexploited arable land, precious metals such as gold and silver, essential minerals such as zinc and iron ore, vast timber reserves, hydrocarbons, and abundant food resources such as fish, all beyond the reach of U.S. military influence. For China, this region represents a strategic solution to its resource vulnerability, especially as its dependence on maritime imports remains a critical vulnerability in the face of potential U.S. naval blockades. One notable example is Lake Baikal, which holds 20% of the world's unfrozen fresh water. In 2019, Chinese companies proposed a bottling plant to export water from the lake to China, sparking widespread protests in Russia. Locals accused China of trying to exploit the lake at their expense, leading to the cancellation of the project by a Russian court. While such ventures face opposition, China's long-term strategy and growing influence over Russia suggest that it will continue to push for greater access to the region's resources. 2 years earlier, Chinese urban planners had proposed building a pipeline to bring water from Lake Baikal to Lanzhou, an arid city in China. Like the bottling plant project, this plan was abandoned largely because of local opposition in Russia. The controversy over Lake Baikal highlights a broader issue: potential conflicts over the Russian Far East. Many local Russians harbor deep suspicions of the growing Chinese presence in the region, and this skepticism has often derailed such initiatives. However, China has a demographic advantage in this regional struggle. Russia's population, currently around 145 million, is projected to shrink to around 135 million by 2050. This decline will disproportionately affect Russia's sparsely populated Far East, a region already suffering from depopulation as residents migrate westwards in search of better opportunities. By 2050, the region's population could shrink to just 5 million. In stark contrast, across the border, China's northeastern provinces are home to some 120 million people. This disparity has fueled Russian fears of a demographic takeover by mass Chinese migration, a scenario often rooted in ethnic bias and suspicion. International marriages between Russians and Chinese are rare, and locals typically view Chinese immigrants with suspicion. Despite these fears, the idea of a Chinese demographic flood has not materialized. In 2019, only about 70,000 Chinese nationals lived in the Russian Far East, a sharp decline from a peak of 200,000 in the 1990s. Nevertheless, China's economic influence in the region has grown significantly. Chinese nationals lease over 100,000 hectares of farmland on 50-year contracts, growing crops such as soya for export to China. They also play a crucial role in industries such as timber and agriculture, filling gaps left by a severe shortage of local Russian labor. For many Chinese workers, these opportunities are a welcome alternative to the limited prospects in their rural and arid hometowns. Moscow is well aware of local hostility to Chinese immigration. To address these concerns, it has introduced measures such as requiring Chinese workers to pass a Russian language test before obtaining temporary visas. But enforcement is lax. Local companies, struggling with labor shortages and desperate for workers, often ignore these rules with the tacit approval of the authorities. With many Russian nationals unwilling to do this kind of work, or leaving the region altogether, businesses rely heavily on Chinese labor. Russia has made attempts to revitalize the Far East and mitigate its population loss. The Ministry for the Development of the Far East, established in 2011, was meant to spearhead regional improvement. However, its efforts have been marred by inefficiency and corruption. For instance, the ministry spent $1.1 billion on constructing the world's largest suspension bridge connecting Vlasto to Rusi Island, a project that has become a bridge to nowhere, offering little benefit to local residents. Critics argue that such projects prioritize prestige over practicality, with much of the allocated funding disappearing into the pockets of officials. This mismanagement raises questions about whether Moscow's neglect of the Far East is intentional. Russia's poor infrastructure in the region is a legacy of its imperial expansion, leaving vast areas disconnected and underdeveloped. Without significant reforms and investments, the Far East risks becoming increasingly dependent on Chinese labor, capital, and influence, a reality that could reshape the region's future. The main road connecting Vladis to Moscow fails to link the Far Eastern regions with one another effectively. This design reflects a historical strategy to keep Siberia isolated and subjugated, a situation that persists to this day. During the Soviet era, various incentives encouraged migration to the Far East, but these programs have long since ended. Without sustained support, it is unsurprising that many have chosen to leave the region. The businesses that remain often face logistical challenges, with many forced to maintain their own roads to access their operations. Corruption further hampers competitiveness, particularly in industries like timber, where many enterprises are entangled in Putin's crony networks. Meanwhile, across the border, China has systematically invested in its northeastern region, significantly reducing poverty and improving infrastructure and connectivity. This connectivity extends beyond China's borders. For instance, China's phone network reaches north of the Amur River, and numerous physical connections already link China to the Russian Far East, with more underway. A high-speed rail line from Beijing to the border is poised for further extension, even without Moscow's formal approval. China also has a significant advantage in international financial markets. Because of Western sanctions, Russian companies in the Far East face exorbitant interest rates of over 25% on loans. By contrast, Chinese lenders offer much more favorable terms with interest rates of around 5%. Naturally, Russian companies are attracted to Chinese financing. A special forum in Kharov, a town just 30 miles from the border, facilitates these investments. It is here that Chinese investors evaluate Russian companies and decide on financing options. For now, Chinese workers in the Russian Far East are mainly on guest visas, but there is no guarantee that this status will remain temporary. Chinese developers are already building additional housing in anticipation of more permanent migration. With growing economic ties between the two nations, more Chinese students are learning Russian, including at Russian universities. This signals the emergence of a new elite that anticipates greater interdependence between the Chinese economy and the Russian Far East. There are also signs of entrenched Chinese influence in the Jewish autonomous region of the Russian Far East. An iron mine has been built, financed and staffed entirely by Chinese nationals. This operation operates almost autonomously, with minimal oversight from the Russian authorities. A planned link to the Chinese rail network will further integrate the mine into China's economic sphere, a process accelerated by the construction of the first bridge over the Amur River. As the war in Ukraine continues to drain Russia's resources, its geopolitical power relative to China is diminishing. This growing imbalance allows China to demand increasingly significant concessions, reshaping the dynamics of their so-called strategic partnership. In June 2023, China secured permission to use Vladivostok as a transit point for its domestic trade, exempt from Russian customs duties. This marked the first time in 163 years that China had access to the port, a development celebrated by Chinese social media users as a symbolic restoration of historical ties. Russia, which originally sought investment from Japan and South Korea to revitalize Vladivostok, found such partnerships unattainable due to the war in Ukraine. As a result, Russia has turned to China to boost the port's economic prospects, reflecting its growing dependence on Beijing. This raises a critical question. Does this arrangement foreshadow further Chinese influence in the Russian Far East? For now, China's strategic focus remains on Taiwan and breaking through the first island chain, a priority driven by both national prestige and the need to secure its vital maritime trade routes. Xi Jinping's reportedly close personal relationship with Vladimir Putin has also strengthened the partnership, likely delaying any overt attempts to reclaim historic territories in the Russian Far East. For now at least, China seems content to expand its economic footprint in the region. However, this equilibrium may not last forever. Xi's tenure as China's de facto leader for life will eventually come to an end, and his successor may take an even more aggressive stance. The historical grievances of the Qing dynasty could resurface under a future, more revanchist administration. Beyond Taiwan, Beijing is also prioritizing restoring its central role in global trade through initiatives such as the Belt and Road. But these efforts face significant obstacles, including unsustainable debt, geopolitical instability, and interference from rival powers such as the United States. The route through the Russian Far East to Europe, involving only one key partner, offers an attractive alternative to the troubled Belt and Road corridors. If these failures continue to mount, the vast resources and strategic location of the Russian Far East could become even more tempting for China. Russia's concession in Vlasto could be just the beginning. While Beijing is unlikely to pursue a Taiwan-style annexation of the region, its increasing economic involvement, coupled with the region's growing dependence on Chinese labor and investment, is strengthening China's influence. It's not inconceivable that, in the future, Beijing could cite the need to protect its nationals in the Russian Far East from perceived discrimination by local authorities, setting the stage for further intervention. By invading Ukraine, Russia effectively severed its ties with the West. This isolation was acceptable to Putin, who wanted to present a united front with China against the Western powers. But the diminished options have weakened Russia's bargaining position. When your position is desperate, concessions to a former adversary, especially one with historical claims and economic clout, can have far-reaching consequences. What does the future hold for the Russian Far East? Can Moscow maintain control over this sparsely populated region in the face of an increasingly assertive and resource-hungry China? With its vast natural wealth and proximity to a much larger Chinese population eager to exploit its opportunities, the region's future seems uncertain. Will this almost empty wilderness remain under Russian sovereignty, or could it gradually fall under China's growing sphere of influence? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most pressing issues. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.